the music's off, there's people here, everyone, your microphones. Hello everyone, thank you for coming this evening. It's so nice to have like a full house of humans. My name is Tai Snaith. I'm an artist and broadcaster, writer. I don't know, you can add as many things on the end of that as you like. First of all, before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that tonight's conversation is taking place on Wurundjeri land, and I'd like to pay my earnest respects to all elders in the audience, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge that the conversation is presented not just with the Wheeler Centre, but in partnership with the Jewish Museum of Australia, and also the Photo 2022 International Festival of Photography. So, that out of the way. We have these amazing artists here tonight, but first I'm just going to talk about what we're going to do. We've got an hour, which seems like a long time, but it's not actually a very long time when you break it down. So first we'll be hearing from each of our panellists and just having a look at a little bit of their work. It's not an artist talk, it's really just warming you up a bit. So I know that most of you will know either one or maybe all of the artists here tonight, but just in case you don't, I thought it would be good to show you a little bit about what they do. But the images they've selected are in relation to the topic tonight, which is developing influences, photography and power. And that's not to be mistaken with developing influencers, although, I mean, you could probably apply that to these guys as well. So we'll have a 10-minute sojourn with each artist and their work, and we'll just have a little brief chat, and then we'll open it up to a discussion amongst ourselves for about 20 minutes if we're lucky, and then we've got 10 minutes at the end to have questions from your good selves. So while we're talking, if there's anything that you think, oh, I'd love to ask that, just make a mental note or make a note in your phone or whatever. And then at the end, there'll be roving mics, Wheeler Centre people, and we can ask you, or you can ask them. So, right, well, let's get started then, shall we? I've got bios here. I've got to read your bio, Atong. So to my left, we're going to start with Atong Atem. So most of you will know Atong because her face is like everywhere at the moment. It's pretty hard to miss Atong. She's around town. There's a giant face of hers down at Parliament. I always forget what that place is called.
Old Treasury Building.
Old Treasury Building. So if you haven't seen that, go down and have a look. It's amazing, part of Photo 2022. And I'll just read her bio for you. Atong Atem is an Ethiopian-born South Sudanese artist and writer living in Nam. Atem works primarily with photography and video to explore migrant narratives, post-colonial practices in the African diaspora, and the exploration of identity through portraiture. Atem explores concepts of home and identity through a critical and sentimental lens, and references the works of photographers Malik Sidibe and Seydou Keita, and science fiction writers such as Octavia Butler as tools for navigating liminal spaces. Atem has exhibited her work across Australia, including MoMA, Monash, Gertrude Contemporary, Australian Centre of Contemporary Art, and internationally at Red Hook Labs in New York, Vogue Fashion Fair in Milan, and Unseen Amsterdam Art Fair. Atem was the recipient of the inaugural National Gallery of Victoria and Mecca M-Power Scholarship in 2018, as well as the Brisbane Powerhouse Melt Portrait Prize in 2017. Shall we give her a clap? I feel like we should clap. So Atong. We're going to start with this image, but I mean, you can sort of talk about whatever you like in this little bit. Maybe we should sort of keep in check with tonight's theme. I think rather than an artist talk, just let's talk about these images and how they relate to that idea of, power of photography or influence. Yeah.
First of all, thank you everyone for coming. It is overwhelming, yet exciting and incredible to see so many people. And I'd also like to acknowledge that we are on Aboriginal land. As we're talking about power within the art realm and specifically with photography, I think acknowledging where we are is really important. So I do like to refer to the fact that I'm in Nam. I'm from Bord, which is the place in South Sudan that I'm from. And I'll get to it in terms of the topic, but I do think that colonialism is a big part of what I make and why I make. Just as like a preface, I don't know if it's cheating or being like an A+ student, but I went to a talk at the Jewish Museum about Helmut Newton with the curator. So I'm one very informed person right now. Because I felt that I needed to do my due diligence as someone whose relationship to, specifically Helmut Newton's work was through specifically fashion and from the lens of, I suppose, that sort of mid-century fashion photography that we conceptually as a body of people are trying to kind of analyse and maybe pick apart and work against. So I thought of Helmut Newton as this guy who took like photos of like sexy white women, and that was sort of it. And the images did not disappoint. But I didn't actually know that Helmut was Jewish, wasn't necessarily a practicing Jew, but was Jewish and was personally affected by the war, and didn't know that he lived in this country. Am I the only one that didn't know that?
I didn't know
that
Please,
either.
someone raise their hands so that I don't feel alone. Thank you so much to the 5 people who also didn't know that. So there was a lot to go on from there. And I think my understanding of his work was kind of changed with all of that. But there is still that element of like, how does this particular person whose relationship to certain people's bodies is sort of fetishistic, and whose ideal kind of like feminine beauty is like a very European feminine beauty that is, idealised in all the nasty ways and all of that sort of stuff. And in talking about that and sort of prefacing, this image behind me is a photo of my parents. It's called Mandut Wundut. And that's the names of my parents. So in Dinka, which is the language that my family and I speak, when you refer to someone, like a person who's got children, you refer to them by their title, which is like man or wun, which is mother or father, and then dut is my brother, who's the oldest in the family. So they're always kind of socially positioned within the context of their eldest child. So they're parents first, like their kind of individual identities are secondary to them being parents. And it's infrared, but it's not really infrared because I don't know how to afford an infrared camera in this economy, but I've got Photoshop. And I'm glad that we mentioned Octavia Butler in that kind of introductory bio, because it's also like, there's a science fictional kind of lens to it. So not to compare, because I think comparing is not always interesting, but, if we were to put my work beside Helmut Newton's work, specifically this work that I chose for tonight, first of all, there's the colour, the fact that he worked almost exclusively in black and white and used film and, that kind of very 50s fashion aesthetic. And I thought that it was really fascinating for me to look at my photography within that sort of, I suppose, that realm of, despite my own relationship to my parents, I'm still presenting them in my own idealised way. Like, just because I love them and they love me, and I've, photographed them in this way that is supposed to present them as like, powerful people who I really admire, I think that my relationship to photography is always one about power and ethics and dynamics, and I've kind of accepted in my journey as a photographer that's inescapable, and maybe my mission, if any, should not be to remove any kind of unethical dynamic, but to just talk about it and acknowledge it. So when I make my photographic works, it is, well, there's an attempt for it to be collaborative, and there's an attempt for it to feel like a union between my aesthetic vision and how the people I'm being presented want to be presented.
So in the case of this portrait, how did that work out, like, pragmatically with your parents? What say did they have in this shoot?
They had a lot of say in this shoot, but by they, and I know this is going to sound heaps like massage, but by they it was my mum who was like, wear this, wear that, to my dad. It's not massage, I take it back. It's because she's really fashionable and she knows aesthetics, and my dad was like, I don't know what to wear. So in the original photo, my mum styled. Essentially, my mum is the stylist in this. So I collaborated with my parents as the sitters and my mum as the stylist. And I photographed them in their backyard as well. So for me, it was about again, to preface, most of my interests in photography stems from an interest in ethnographic photography, so those sort of deeply colonial depictions of predominantly black and brown people across the world from a European lens. And I like to use the tropes of those photographs, which is unsmiling people, kind of situated, facing the camera, almost as objects, but I'm not going to say I'm objectifying because there's consent, which is the main difference. So I'm always interested in placing people in their place and kind of creating a narrative that is, documenting the people that I'm photographing in some kind of way, but allowing them to have an input in how they're documented. So I asked them to wear what they wanted to wear. I told them where I wanted to photograph them. It was like kind of terrible lighting, so it was really hard to get a photo without them sort of like trying to avoid the sun directly in their eyes. And then the rest of it was just sort of like, let's have a conversation while I'm photographing you. I'm not asking you to do anything other than just sit and I'll move around you, which is, different to fashion photography in that way as well.
And in terms of the fabric, I know you use fabric a lot as a backdrop or as a prop. So the fabric that's draped across the background, I originally thought it was a tree actually, and then I realised it's not a tree, it's got patterns on it.
Yeah.
So was that something that you chose with your mum, or like, is that,
Interestingly enough, I originally was not going to have any fabric, but then my mum, because it's not a secret anymore, but she follows me on Instagram. And if you ever see like a comment under any of my pictures on Instagram that's like 7,000 different kinds of love hearts, that's probably my mum. She's just like, woo, my daughter, heart, heart, heart. And I'm like, yeah, you upgraded your phone. Great. Like, I love that. Thanks, Mum. She's an absolute darling. But because she's been following my work for a really long time, and she recognises the references, those kind of studio photography references, and again, in I'm sure we'll talk about it later, but the familial references from like family photo albums and that sort of thing, she could almost make my work for me. So she was like, oh, but we have to have fabrics. I have all of these fabrics that just came in from Kenya. Your auntie dropped them off. Let's try this, let's try that. And I was like, yeah, babe. Like,
I love
let's
it.
do it. So again, it was collaborative.
No,
and I think
nice.
I suppose that's what I strive to do, to have that collaborative thing.
Sometimes harder with your mum than anyone else.
I have to let go. She's a Gemini, so I just let her have what she wants.
Shall we move on to the next slide?
Let's move on.
So there's two on this one. Oh, you can see them over there. Yep.
Yeah. I'll just quickly say, can everybody pretend not to see that image with me in the green face? Because I was not supposed to post it. It was supposed to be for a future exhibition, so just like block one.
Hard not to see that one.
I got a text that was like, remember when you said you were saving these for an exhibition? I was like, I'm so sorry. So this is that sort of self-portraiture thing that I was talking about. And the reason that I've arrived at self-portraiture as a big part of my practice is I think that playing around with ethics or questions of ethics and consent and all of that stuff is safest when you're doing it with yourself. And again, like, I don't think that the aim of photography should ever be to be purely, like, it can be, but that's not important really in terms of being as ethical as possible or not. But I think talking about it and acknowledging that there is an ethical dilemma inherently in the act of photographing and capturing another person is important. And with my photography, especially because I'm talking about family and history and colonialism and bringing up like potentially really traumatizing and triggering things when I photograph other people, it makes so much sense to explore that safely, and I can do that by photographing myself. And I guess for me as well, like when it comes to power and all of that stuff, like what we're talking about today, it doesn't disappear just because I'm photographing myself. And before I brought up like objectification, which is present in a lot of historically celebrated photography, and especially in that sort of historical ethnographic stuff, it's interesting to think about that in relation to how you depict yourself as well. So I'm always, I suppose, using lots and lots of different tools like face paint, like costume, set, prop, all of that stuff to play with, I suppose, how have I been taught to idealise myself and what parts of myself when I take a photograph of myself, which is, you know, a truthful depiction or, you know, absolutely not fictional or whatever, what am I doing to create myths about myself in the act of taking a photograph? And in having that dialogue with myself, it's like, well, there's always going to be something that's fictional, so why not go all the way there? Why not just create mythology with my photographic practice? Which is what I do.
That's really amazing. I feel like I could spend the whole 60 minutes talking to each of you separately. I just get lost in it, but I'm already behind time.
Sorry.
I've got to whip myself into gear here. Thank you, Atong. That was amazing.
Thank
We're just
you.
going to move on so that we can actually have a discussion, because I think that will be really interesting. So next, we're going to talk to Shannon. Shannon May Powell is a writer and artist based on Sovereign Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country. Their work explores gender, sexuality and impermanence with analogue photography, text, video and somatic practice. Their work has featured both nationally and internationally at Berlin Feminist Film Festival, New York Art Book Fair, Centre for Contemporary Photography and International Photo 2020 Festival here in Naarm. Much of their recent work was developed during the VADA residency, which I heard about backstage, in California, where they were fortunate enough to be an artist in residence during 2018, 2019 and 2020. Last night, they launched their debut poetry and photo book, The Amnesia of Pleasure, with local publishers No More Poetry. Round of applause for Shannon, please. Welcome.
Thank you.
So we'll just go straight to you. Yours are all on one frame, which is easy for me.
Yeah.
So in terms of the relationship between power and influence in your work, Shannon, would you like to speak to... You don't have to speak to these, but, you know, it's an easy way to kind of get into it. They're amazing images.
Thank you. I love that you brought up the story about your mum on social media, because this is my mother's hand.
Wow.
And a friend once contacted me on Facebook and was like, "Who's Linda Young?" And I was like, "Oh, that's my mum. Why?" And they're like, "Oh my God, I thought you had a stalker." Yeah, so bless the matriarchs in the room.
That is funny.
Yeah, but I definitely also really resonate with this idea of sharing power. I usually only work with subjects that I'm really intimate with, family, friends, or in the off chance that I do kind of more commercial work. You know, I really like to get to know my subjects and their stories as a way of kind of honouring them and being able to witness them really authentically. So yeah, this first picture is my mother's beautiful hands. I've never seen her nails unpainted. The second picture is a friend of mine in California. We were working legally trimming weed on a weed farm, and we found a pair of chaps. Amazing. And I just love the idea of playing with gender, you know. We've got the motorbike here, and, you know, we have stereotypical ideas about what genders ride a motorbike or what genders wear a pair of black leather chaps. And then the third picture, I really wanted to name these artists that I photographed for Dark Mofo. They're from a band called Teto Preto, and the lead singer is Laura Diaz at the front, and the dancer and performance artist's name is Loic. And I thought this photo was really powerful considering the subject we're talking about, because Laura particularly is like a frontline activist as well as a artist and performer in the LGBTQIA plus scene over in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. And she just has such incredible beliefs around power. And I actually wanted her voice to be present, and because I interviewed her for this photo shoot. And she said in the interview, just verbatim, "We always get undressed by men, systematically and structurally. Faced with that, I give myself fully. I use nudity and the totally exposed body as a powerful experience that is in opposition to the exploited nude. I devour the oppressive symbols, batons, guns, military costumes, and sadomasochists." And she refers to this idea of carnivorously devouring her own objectification to become her own master and owner. And I loved this photo because she's, you know, holding the collar of her own costume. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I mean, I can sort of see similarities between what Atong was saying with the self-portrait and how there's still a level of consent in photographing yourself, and there's still a level of sort of rebellion or consent in terms of her work as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I wanted to name them and, you know, bring her voice into this moment, because they really art directed it. I was just there as a witness. So yeah, I love this idea of, you know, the embodied photographer daring the gaze to be returned, you know, daring to step down from that hierarchy that you have in the power dynamic of photography and allow the subjects to, you know, do that.
Their thing. Yeah. And also just the angle, I mean, being sort of underneath, like quite drastically as well, though, really looking down.
It was also shot on the top of a mountain peak in Tasmania, and it was like sub-0 degrees, and she was almost entirely naked. So I'm very into, you know, I so rarely construct scenes, which is why I find your work so fascinating and beautiful, that you create these worlds. I'm kind of just usually choose a location and we just go there and see what happens, what emerges in the moment.
And in each of these three, before we move on to James, in each of these three images, I just wanted to sort of mention the idea of cropping in terms of power. And I know that that's something that not everyone finds easy to do, but I've seen a lot of your work does that. Is that...
What was the...
just cropping, like the frame, as in
cropping,
sort of being quite close in.
Yeah, I love the intimacy. I think, again, coming back to this idea of, you know, feeling embodied in when you're behind the lens and, you know, you have that responsibility of sharing power with your subject. I always come back to this amazing talk that I watched, the director of Transparent, that TV series, Jill Soloway, who has since transitioned. At the time was Jill Soloway, gave a talk about coining the female gaze, and then they spoke about an artist who talks about feeling seeing rather than objectifying your feeling seeing. You're using the gaze in a different way, and had actually trained all of her camera people for the whole series in that kind of technique of feeling, seeing, and being more embodied, so that you're not stealing or capturing or shooting something.
Like a type of empathetic gaze.
Yeah, it's like, you know, because photography can use very violent language. And I listened to a video with Helmut Newton today, and he referred to himself as a gun for hire.
The symbology of the gun.
So, I mean, there's a whole nother riff we could go on here. But
let's hold that thought, because I feel like that's something we should talk about in the conversation. But next we're on time, sort of just. James is next, last but not least. James J. Robinson is an Australian-Filipino artist based in LA. James's work is regularly published by the likes of the New York Times and Vogue Australia, working with names like Kylie Jenner, Rihanna, and Virgil Abloh, while creative directing and shooting campaigns for Instagram and Maison Valentino. With a background in literature and lighting design, James's work exists within the realms of poetic realism, choosing to shoot in everyday locations we're familiar with, but amplifying the quiet beauty through lighting. This style of poetic realism derives from his desire to heal oppressive systems within the industry and media, casting everyone from his family to academics he admires. He hopes to use his work to champion the faces and voices that were missing from the media when he was growing up. Beyond his photography and filmmaking work, James is also a writer, lighting designer, and public speaker. Welcome, James. Oh, hang on.
Hello, thank you.
Move it on. Oh, I forgot my task. There we go.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's such a pleasure to be up here with some of my favorite people, so thank you. Yeah, I think it's interesting to sit alongside other photographers, because I kind of don't generally think of myself as a photographer. I mean, we're all artists and everyone kind of dips in and out of different art forms and everything, and I think that for me, photography is just like this tiny part of the process at the end of a whole other thing that I'm trying to do. And yeah, I don't know, I never wanted to be a photographer. I never knew who Helmut Newton was growing up. I didn't really know like what cool photographers were. And I feel like so many other artists that I know, I kind of just feel like I don't really know what I'm doing, and that like someday someone's gonna like pull a gun to me and be like, the jig's up, like, I don't know, just that like they're gonna do their research and be like, oh, this guy's actually never studied this, like he doesn't really know what he's doing. And it's true, I don't really know what I'm doing.
That's why you're good, I think.
And I think that's why when I think about photography, I think think about trying to deconstruct my ego. And it's something that we've all kind of shared as well in the process of photo taking, is that, you know, there is this inherent power dynamic that happens when you're taking photos of someone. And for a little period when I was in New York, I was like working and supporting some other photographers, like working as an assistant and doing some behind the scenes kind of video work. And then, you know, you'd see these like massive photographers who shall remain unnamed. And the way that they would treat other people on the set, like the way that they would talk down to assistants, and the way that it'd be like just them, was like this big like ego trip to be like, it's just me and this subject, and like I'm gonna capture you, like no one else like matters. Like, I don't know, I think like being in those spaces and like seeing that happen, I'm just like, that's just like so anti everything that I think photography should be. And I guess that's kind of the world that Helmut Newton came from. It was like gazy, and it was ego, and it's like, this is me, I'm the photographer. Like, it's almost like the identity of the person that you're taking photos of is like removed from what actually ends up being the image. So yeah, in my work, I would consider the process kind of to be more about the bringing communities together and putting them in fun outfits and like actually just having fun, and like, I guess just like taking a photo at the end of that is just like the tiniest part of the process. And I guess like, so I'm doing this photo shoot next week, and they're like asking me to shoot on digital, which I never do, I only ever shoot on film. But they were like, no, we just need to see it on digital because we need to make sure that everything's perfect. But the reason that I shoot on film is because I'm like, I actually don't really care if it's not perfect. You know, I feel like if I like bring together all these people and like we kind of don't get the best photo out of it, like, as I said, like the bringing together of the people is what the process is for me. That I don't really care if we don't get like this perfect image and like the model's hair like isn't behind her shoulder or something. It's almost a byproduct of the performance or the act. Yeah? Exactly, yeah, and it kind of also contributes to like then making the image like fake and trying to like, I don't know, compose something that shouldn't really exist. So anyway, yeah, this is a photo of my Auntie Norma, and I've also got my Lola there and my mum who's sitting right there. Sorry, Mum, I know she doesn't like it when I show photos of her. Didn't realize you were going to come until last minute, sorry. Very funny how we've all kind of got images of our mums. Yeah.
We know where the power lies.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, I mean, this photo and the other photos that I've kind of given you guys are photos that kind of encapsulate what that process is of bringing together family, bringing together friends, and actually just having fun and seeing the way that photography can really be used to empower, and it can be used to challenge and question, yes.
May I also point out and maybe get you to extrapolate on the chainsaws that are in every photo?
Well, it's funny because I actually did not really realize that it's a motif that I had until there was an article that came out, and this author who had interviewed me, he was like, James uses chainsaws in his work, and I was like, do I? And then I went back through and I was like, yeah, God, I guess I do, hey.
Just something you had lying around.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think, yeah, as we were talking about, like, empowerment, like, not just empowerment through, like, getting someone there and, like, being, like, you know, like, 'cause yeah, if you're gonna take a photo of someone, I'm like, I don't want to like get this fake form of empowerment. I need to create a space where you're actually gonna give that to me, and you actually do feel like you're empowered. And that involves like feeding the people on set. It involves being kind to the assistant on set, and it goes to the way that you're gonna light them and making sure that they feel comfortable, and also getting consent every step along the way and checking in, making sure that everyone's happy with how they feel.
Are they ever on or?
No, so this one that on the left there is of this musician, Georgia Mack from Camp Cope, which is one of my favorite bands, and we took this photo out the front of George Pell's old office at the Catholic Archdiocese.
Really? That's so cool.
I mean, I'm not that religious, as you can maybe tell. I mean, unless there's heaven, in which case I am. But yeah, no, I think that the chainsaw is such a, as we were talking about before, as you had said as well, like with the motorcycle and the way that these objects have their own kind of inherent meaning, and also the way that they're gendered in this way. I really love just trying to break outside of that binary, and then also kind of finding ways that, yeah, through objects and through bringing together a group of people, we can find a way to empower the people in our community. And yeah, that's why I kind of take myself out of it and don't consider myself a photographer, because I'm like, I'm just bringing you together and
facilitating.
I guess like, facilitating something and
and capturing it, really.
Yeah,
that's such a good way to put it. All right, look, we're bang on time. So I'm really keen to get to the discussion. They were all amazing little snippets, I think, into their practices, which is what I wanted to provide for you. But I do also want to hear the way that, the ideas of the group, particularly around some things that you've all touched on in regards to the Helmut Newton exhibition. And I mean, I myself experienced a fairly major backlash from just posting some of Helmut Newton's images on my Instagram, which I didn't think would happen. But there's a really big division between like loving him, hating him. Well, not really him, but I guess what he represented. And so I'm going to just start the conversation off a little bit about, we know obviously the criticism is around the idea of the white male gaze. Like that's, not really relevant anymore, but also, a lot of people think that there was misogyny wrapped up in that. A lot of people don't. A lot of people feel like the women were empowered. A lot of people don't. There's this real division. But I guess my question is, how do you feel about this? But also, how do you feel about the way the gaze has changed? Anyone can just jump in. There's no pattern.
I'll jump in then, since there's no power.
Yeah, no power.
I have actually been thinking a lot about it. Power dynamic, specifically Helmut Newton and other photographers like him. And I have like 2,000 thoughts about it. But
Maybe just a couple.
To keep it on topic, the main sort of thought that I have is like, why is the work problematic? What's the problem with the work? Because so much of it is stunning, like extremely, extremely beautiful.
Formally.
Yeah, but even for me, understanding, what it means for someone like him to take photos of the people that he photographed and blah, 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 I'm still like, yeah, it's beautiful, very beautiful. Especially for some reason, I love like the photographs that he does, which to me read as like purely fetish, like photos of like people in high heels and it's just the heels and all that sort of stuff. And I think like the problem is that he, and maybe I've missed it, he and like people that have spoken about his work since and people that make similar work don't acknowledge what they're doing. Like if it was like, I am obsessed with this sort of thing and I've reached out to people who are obsessed with showing that sort of thing, then it would completely be different, as opposed to in interviews I've read about him, he's like, I love women. It's like, no, you don't. You love a very specific type of woman and you haven't defined what that love means, and you are objectifying in that sort of fetishistic way. So yeah, I think like the problem isn't the images inherently, like those people are real. Yeah, there are people that have those bodies and they exist in the world. It's I suppose trying to use those images to define any one group,
Yeah, and sort of they all become one amorphic group in a way. I read this great quote I just wanted to mention in regards to that by one of my favourite musicians, Grace Jones, who was photographed by Helmut Newton. And this actually was quite interesting because a lot of the women that he's photographed are fans. Like they want to be photographed by him in the first place. And they all read to me as really strong women. But this was her take. He was a little bit pervert, but so am I, so it was okay. He was never vulgar. And I just thought that was quite interesting. Like, is it okay, to be a little bit pervert, as long as you're not offensive? Like as long as you're not vulgar or mean or, like, where is that line, Maybe, Shannon, you could...
So blurry and so influenced by, context and culture as well. Where is the line?
Do you think about that when you're shooting? Like, do you think about how that will be perceived in terms of vulgarity, let's just say, or...
I mean, yeah, I came into my research of Helmut Newton from like a harsh perspective as well, because, it's very homogenous. There's certain types of bodies. I also know that a lot of his very publicised work, everyone just focused on the hypersexualized stuff, and there was an interview where he's like, I take great photographs of the ocean, portraits of men also, but no one wants anything to do with those. So I wonder also how much is the audience's projection of, fetishism and stuff like that, and how much, shame around sexuality is bound up in how we interact with images and with bodies. So we're all responsible for the gaze, you know.
Yeah.
It's not just the people behind the lenses. We're all responsible for the gaze.
That's so true. And I think also, I mean, one thing I learned from going to the show was just that I knew nothing of his wife, his partner, Alice Springs, who was also such a great pseudonym, I have to say, who was also a photographer. But in some of the, from since then researching her a little bit, in some of the shots where there's Helmut, a naked female in front of him, a mirror, and then to the side, Alice Springs sitting there and looking like quite directorial. And part of me, like that shifted something in me as well as like, what is it when, I mean, how does it change then if it's a partner, like a couple directing the male gaze? Or is that still the male, you know what I mean? Like, is that still objectifying these women when a woman may have introduced him to the subjects? You know, she was a performer and quite radical, and I just found that kind of made it different for me in a way as well. Like, I think there's so many areas of ambiguity, you know.
And I mean, all we can do is hypothesize unless we speak to his subjects or speak to him as well.
And a lot of them have been interviewed and say they loved it. I mean, maybe they just haven't found the ones that are traumatised and...
Yeah, true.
Maybe it's the context that the images are shown in, because if they were shown in, like, I don't know, a porn magazine, I feel like the conversation would be entirely different. It's just the fact that they were sort of, you know, he was a fashion photographer and his main shtick was like presenting women's fashion to women in the 20th century. Maybe that's the thing. Like, you know, I've seen significantly smuttier, more like vulgar stuff that I have no, you know, qualms with because of the context in which it's presented. And I don't even know, like I haven't done the research to establish whether the photographer was nice to the subjects or not, but because it's, you know, there's an idea that the intention of the work was, you know, the person's going to be showing their boobs or whatever in this particular way for this particular purpose.
Not fashion.
Versus like it's a Louis Vuitton campaign or whatever, and it's like, what is that saying about, you know, fashion as this like consumer product, and how do you present consumable stuff with people's bodies in this sort of like non-pornographic context?
And is that okay in the first place?
I mean, if everyone's okay with it, I'm okay with it.
Yeah, well, that's what's interesting. I mean, I think that's kind of the point. Like, I spoke to another artist in Berlin who's a photographer, and I was saying this to you backstage, but it's worth sharing in that she said she had always just thought that Helmut was, you know, objectifying women and just that didn't think much more about it. And she shoots naked men. And then when she was asked to sort of pose naked for another photographer, I'm not sure whether they were male or female, it doesn't really matter, but maybe in this context it does, but she said she started thinking about how she would like to be depicted as a nude, and the first thing that came to mind was his photographs. And that really changed her perspective on what it is to, like, if you imagine yourself as a nude, like, maybe that is an empowering way to imagine it. And, you know, maybe different sexual levels of sexuality, or, you know, maybe different in that sense, but, like, as an empowered, fierce female, maybe it's not bad. But anyway, James, maybe talk about like the music industry as well, because I know you've had a lot to do with that. And how does empowerment work there? And in terms of the line of like what's acceptable, what's vulgar, what's, you know.
Yeah, God. As Shannon was saying just before, they made such a good point. Just it's so different and informed by different cultures and different backgrounds. And like, you know, I went to like a Catholic school. They're going to look at these images in a completely different way to someone who went to a Steiner school or something, for example. But yeah, I think just one thing that I wanted to comment on before is that we've been talking about how some of his subjects have spoken out and been like, actually, we really loved being photographed by Helmut Newton. I actually watched that film where all of these subjects spoke out being like, yeah, no, we actually really loved being able to be photographed by him, and then found out that the director was this guy who was like, cancel culture shouldn't exist. And like
handpicked.
So I was reading the reviews of this documentary, and what a lot of people were commenting on was saying that like it was too much, like he only picked subjects who he knew was going to say something positive.
I assumed that as well. Yeah, they can't all.
Yeah, it's because I feel like obviously, like, I mean, any photographer like who's done anything wrong, I'm sure you'll find someone who's like, yeah, I had a great time with Terry Richardson or something, you know. And if you like found them, like, you can kind of curate it to look however you want to. But in this same documentary, Helmut Newton's talking about when he's photographing all these women, and as you said before, Atong, he was like, I love women. And so one thing that I'm super interested in is unpacking the gaze in as many ways as we can. And so for me, it's like, well, if you love women, why not give a woman a camera? Why not produce a photo shoot and not let it come from your gaze? You know, I feel like it's almost like then the ego is coming into it, being like, I love women, but from my perspective.
Yeah, when they
not
make
I
money
love
for
women
me.
generally. Exactly. And yeah, I don't know, but it is interesting also then to think about how the other work that he does, and then seeing the way that the culture's kind of just like put him as this one thing that kind of just like, yeah, I don't know, puts him into a little bit of a box. And I think as artists as well, like other people can put our work into boxes too, and it can be very constricting. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's like.
But on that idea of boundaries, and like, say you're working, because you've done a lot of commercial work as well.
Yeah.
And you have a really broad practice that goes from very hyper commercial work to really free, like almost not photography at all. When you're working with those commercial clients, like where where does that consent or that boundary exist? Do they set that, or does their agent set that, or like how does that work?
Yeah, so generally if you're like wanting to like ask a model to get to that point, particularly when it's in like a commercial context, it's going to be getting permission through their agent. But even then it kind of feels like you're not necessarily getting permission directly from them. And you also have to like remember that there's always power dynamics attached to that like you're asking them, would you appear nude in this context? And they might say yes, but also like their livelihoods might depend on this job. Like where are their paychecks coming from? And so there's all these dynamics, and the same thing with Helmut Newton and people being like, well, I want him to be the person that photographs me. There is a power dynamic there that's coming into it because he's such a celebrated photographer. And that kind of, I guess, then kind of starts blurring the consent in that same sense.
That's about power, right?
I think it goes back to power. But in the same context, thinking about commercial work, and as someone who works like in the fashion world and also does commercial work, it's almost like sometimes because some of these images were shot for fashion brands and they were shot for Vogue, I don't think we can forget the fact that there's inherently then this level of consumerism to it as well. And that, yes, we're allowing this person to be empowered, but we're empowering them because we want to sell the shoes that they're wearing.
Or the magazine even.
Then how does like capitalist structures tie into that? And then when we have capitalist structures which are then upholding the gender structures that we're trying to deconstruct, how can you really empower someone in an image if you're trying to sell something?
So within fashion, how can you do that? Like, how can you use that as your vehicle and yet sort of take it apart at the same time?
Yeah, God, I don't know. I mean, I'm moving out of the fashion industry for this reason.
Right. And is that a conscious choice?
It's a very conscious choice, yeah. I mean, I did this one project. It was for a underwear brand, which shall remain unnamed also. But they were wanting to do their organics line, and they were like, oh, finally we're going to become like a sustainable fashion brand. But in the process of doing this shoot, they flew 20 people over from Australia to LA to shoot, were driving us all around in vans, and like just had all this energy and all this consumption. But then the actual image that they're putting up is them being like, yeah, we're super sustainable.
Wow.
And so I guess it's a good insight into the performative nature when it comes to the commercial world, when it comes to fashion. And same thing where it's like, yeah, cool, in this beautiful fashion campaign, we're empowering our models. But at the same time, it's like, are you? You're just empowering the clothes. That's the ultimate goal. That's like the context.
It's a contradiction. I mean, I heard about Madonna's NFT today. That's
what is it?
Evidently, it's like a hyper-realist sort of video of her, whether it's constructed or shot, I'm not sure, but it has sort of this digital tree growing out of her vulva.
I just want to say that I thought it was really beautiful.
I mean, it might be really beautiful, but like, talk about mixed messages. Yeah, I love the environment, but let's just mine data with heaps of power to get the message across. So I think it's that contradiction we live in, and more, I mean, social media is something we haven't really touched on, maybe a little bit, but that the contradictions that lie within that as an empowerment tool, but also as a sort of terribly scary world at the same time. Does anyone want to speak to that, whether it's been useful for you or how you navigate that? Atong maybe, or I'm not sure, whoever.
I just need to clarify, I thought the visuals were beautiful.
Okay, Madonna, yeah.
I'm not pro NFT. Let the record state, I'm not pro NFT. Interestingly enough, speaking of social media and NFTs, the amount of intense pressure to make NFTs as an artist, I'm sure you've both had
It's everywhere.
to the point where it was like, is this just the industry standard now? Like, will I only ever be offered jobs that, you know,
Have
that
an
are NFTs? And I consistently, I mean, I suppose I dabbled in kind of commercial photography, sort of, taking photographs of like my musician friends and that sort of stuff, and a little bit of fashion here and there. So I've never put my whole entire, like, both feet into the commercial world, and I can only imagine the level of like complete uncertainty that exists there, because you're sort of bowing to the winds of, not whims, the winds of the capitalist world around you and those influences, and we're being sold what we like, and then that sort of, anyway. But yeah, I would say I also wanted to note, before we forget, about Helmut Newton, that from what I learnt at the talk is that he learnt photography from a female photographer who taught him, you know, everything he knows. So I think that's also interesting too. But yeah, I don't know, social media is like, so like, it's a lot, isn't it? I find it really useful. Like, I would not be making work at all if it wasn't for tumblr.com in 2007.
Same.
And that's a fact. And I probably wouldn't be exhibiting work as well within like an artistic context if it wasn't for Instagram, because so recently that image that I showed before that I said don't look at, I posted it, and I referenced the artist who is someone on Instagram whose name is, I will remember it because it's really important to acknowledge people.
Let's look at it again.
So it was inspired by an artist who I found on Instagram who does this incredible face painting stuff and takes these real close kind of cropped photographs of their face. And I thought it was really, really beautiful. And their work, they've been doing that same work for longer than I've probably been publicly showing my work. And there's just an interesting thing where there's a lot of artists whose work is seen as just social media work. Like, and it's like really, you know, in terms of the context, in terms of the presentation, in terms of the references, their art could also be in the NGV, but what is the difference really between, I don't know, I just find Instagram really interesting in that way. It's sort of like, you know, we're supposed to avoid getting trapped in it or something, but it's also the only reason that I am sitting here having a chat with all of yous. Like, it's kind of odd in that way. But just to touch really quickly again on the stuff about like power and, you know, blah, 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 and I think this is really relevant. It is really, really hard to forget that power doesn't exist in a vacuum, and I'm really glad that you touched on capitalism, because when we're talking about a fashion photographer who made work in the mid-century in Vogue magazine and became like world-renowned, like that is that's a capitalist story. Yeah, well, yeah. And like this sort of like, I mean, the story could also be presented as this like capitalist fantasy of success, but like at whose expense and at what cost? Because what is that legacy? Aside from beautiful imagery that is referenced over and over and over again by like anybody that's got any interest in fashion, what is the actual legacy, and how has that led to it being, you know, 2022, we've just had Fashion Week in Sydney, and people are still having the same conversations that we were having when Helmut Newton was first making images for Vogue magazine about the power of fashion, the power of representation, and blah, 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 blah.
But things have changed, you know, like what has changed, Shannon? What do you think like has changed? It's a long time since the height of the 80s. Like, so
in the gaze or
in the gaze, yeah.
I'm just thinking about how, you know, themes or intentions of empowerment, when they start to interact with systems like patriarchy and, you know, colonization and, what's it called? Capitalism. That one. What happens? Like it depurifies, you know, the intention there. It takes the power away from. I'm thinking about that documentary, The Social Dilemma, which I'm sure many of us have seen, and how they talk about the race to the brainstem. You know, the brainstem, as we know, connects to the nervous system. So you're literally disempowering someone at a nervous system level. So I'm not naive to the fact of trying to, you know, market empowerment while simultaneously disempowering people from their nervous system, bringing them to a platform like social media.
And also the right of speech and right of passage and all that stuff.
Yeah, but on the other hand, you know, it's such an amazing kind of democratic tool for independent artists. So it's like a both and sort of situation. Like, how do we hold both of those things
without letting one just gobble up the other one?
Yeah.
I think I think we've naturally reached a little bit of a spot, and it's almost 10 minutes till the end, a little bit more. But so if there's anyone in the audience that would like to now ask a question of one of these three, I'm sure there's questions out there. I'm just going to put it back on that so I'm fair. There's two lovely people to the side there, if you can see. So put your hand up in the audience. I can't really see very well, but put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question. There's one just here. Yep.
Hello?
There you go.
Or hello. Thank you, all three of you. I had a question about accountability. Atong, I thought you said something interesting about Helmut Newton almost not feeling the need to communicate process and intention. And I sort of, where I went to with that was like, it's almost like this sort of male entitlement, like why would I need to? Like why would I need to even speak about that? And I was interested from the three of you about process and communicating process and being held accountable by a community with the images you are kind of making and worlds you're creating.
Yeah, it's interesting almost just rolling off social media. It's like now with social media, everyone's got a voice, so anyone can be held accountable. Pre-social media, I wonder with someone like Helmut Newton, how do you even begin to start like a more grassroots community kind of discussion around what his work is in the 80s when there's all these structures and people don't really have a voice. So Atong, there was a really beautiful question in there for you, but I'm forgetting what it was.
About accountability.
Accountability, yeah.
How do you that was it, wasn't it? How do you communicate accountability to your subject? Or sort of practice it? Yeah. Sorry, do you want to refresh again?
Hey. Not particularly within like photographer and person being photographed, but just like this idea of, which I think James was on like an interesting kind of riff there of like, if Helmut Newton had Instagram, was posting the images that he's created, then anyone has the ability to interact with it, therefore be like, hey, what are you doing here?
Oh, therefore he's held accountable.
Yeah, in that way. And I'm just sort of, interested by like the three of you, if you think about process and accountability and where that comes from, potentially like where you've learnt that in your community.
I don't know if this is necessarily answering what you're asking, but tangents are good, and I'll keep it short. I do find it really fascinating because I think I used to care really, really deeply about that, about like doing the right thing by the people I'm photographing, and I think also that ties into me wanting to do the right thing by my culture and like respecting my culture and trying to do these really specific like practices and processes, and all that really did for me, really, outside of consent and acknowledging and relationship and communication, that's sort of the best we can do, because people do kind of grow and change and evolve, cultures grow, change, evolve, your aesthetics do as well. So I feel like in terms of accountability, it's almost, an impossible cycle. The thing that I care more about personally is like having an ethical relationship to who and what I'm photographing, and that also extends to like the land that I'm photographing on, the tools that I'm using, and what I'm like trying to say, and all of that. That's all I will say about that. Yeah, what do you think, Shannon?
Well, personally, definitely it's relationship based. Everything I do is relationship based, but particularly working with bodies and photography. I work as a I'm training as a somatic therapist, and I work with an organisation that works with traumatised communities. So I'm trained in trauma-informed facilitation, and I feel so grateful to have that training, you know, because if you're working with bodies, you're working with trauma, especially if you're in a power dynamic situation where you're holding, you know...
A loaded gun.
A loaded gun, as Helmut Newton would say. So that's my, you know, personal accountability process. But I also feel really grateful to be part of a broader community that, you know, we all hold one another accountable.
Yeah, I also feel like there's just something that, like, you're not always going to be able to please everyone all the time. So it always, it does go back to the intention. There's also, I think, being artists, it's like once your work is released, it's not yours anymore. Once it actually goes out there and once it becomes exhibited and once it goes on Instagram, people are going to have their own relationship to it, and people are going to find their own ways to understand what you're doing, and they're going to view it through your lens. So trying to like appease everyone all the time can be a process that might actually just restrict you in your practice. So I think as long as it's going to the actual taking of the image and relating to that person, then that's where the accountability should really happen in your...
It's interesting to think that with social media as well. I was just thinking, you know, people share it, they almost like take it as their own, but then put words to it also. It's almost like it's impossible to control how it's framed now, isn't it?
It will live on beyond, you know, the person who took the photo. Like, you know, people will be talking about Atong's work in the metaverse one day. And I'm sure Helmut Newton...
Especially if she makes an NFT.
You know? Yeah, exactly.
It makes me think about the whole Marilyn Monroe dress saga. It's like, that's kind of inevitable with all art, you know, and with all kind of things that are put out into... Like
the person dies.
Yeah.
The thing lives on.
And then what, you know? Yeah. But that's so far left of field from the question, isn't it?
Shall we've got a little bit of time left. Is there another question? I feel one. Come on. Juicy question to finish on. Oh, they're also... Yes, there's one.
Hi, thank you so much for all the things you've shared so far. My question would be, what would you see as your biggest challenge in creating images ethically for you in your photography practice?
Good question.
Yeah, I think it's kind of what I was talking about before, is just taking out the ego as much as possible and letting that person just be their own thing and not necessarily trying to put your gaze into it and being like, this is how I see this thing. I think the question should be, how do you want to be seen, rather than how do I see you? So I feel like that's one of the biggest ones,
But just to make that more tricky, say you've been noticed for doing a picture where you've given the person free rein to be themselves, and then someone else, like a client, comes along and says, I love that one where she was wearing a habit with a chainsaw, can you do that again for me? Like, how ethically, what do you do in that situation?
That's a good question. I love that. I mean, I guess you just can't recreate that. Like, no matter how much someone wants to do something. I mean, also you'll find in commercial world, they'll say they want to do something cool and edgy like that, but then when it gets to it, they're like,
they don't.
Just make sure the shoes look good. Like, so I think that like when you kind of
don't block the shoes with the chainsaw. Just make it up there.
I don't know. I feel like you can't really apply those two same situations, and I just wouldn't even try doing that.
So is it a matter of, I mean, as an artist myself, I feel like, you know, I'm confronted with this too, because I'm constantly trying to do different things so that I'm not pigeonholed into one thing, right? But so it's a matter of articulating that from the outset, right? That the way I work is to, you know, work with my subject, be fully transparent. I don't subscribe to these, you know, it's kind of important, right? That you get that message out before you get into that relationship. Yeah,
because it's happened a lot of times where I'll say that this is what I do, and then you end up getting into the actual process of working with someone, and they're like, okay, cool, we've got your name on board for the project, like tick some diversity boxes in hiring you, and now we're going to get you to do this like total other thing. But I think just like trying to unpack that ego and just trying to be like, okay, I'm taking photos of someone, for whatever reason I've ended up on this set with this person. I'm just going to make sure that we're relating to each other, and I'm going to try and capture you nonetheless in whatever context. Yeah.
I think like the working relationship is really important too. It's like whoever's contacting you, like make sure there's a relationship there as well, you know, which might mean slowing down the process, which they might not be happy with, but whatever.
Yeah, I think that's the power in slowing something down is huge, isn't it?
Because the giant time's up, and I was like, oh no.
Okay, we're gonna end on that because it's like red.
It's so scary.
But first, before we finish, a couple of things. I wanted to mention that all three of you have things on at the moment. So James has a show on at the gallery's name. That's
Hillvale.
Hillvale, and it is still on till Sunday, and it's really worth checking out. It's a beautiful new body of work. Shannon has a book that's just been launched through No More Poetry, and where can we see that book or get that book?
Lots of different stockists, but you can go straight to nomorepoetry.com, I think, maybe. Yeah.
I actually sat next to them at the art book fair. Lovely people.
Lovely people. Yeah.
Worth supporting.
Yeah.
And Atong has a new book that's coming out this week, or has just been, it's hot. I know it's hot off the press. On Saturday.
Yes, at the photo book weekend.
And so people can go to that event, and you're speaking as well, aren't you?
Yes.
Again, you've been speaking so much. She's
say?
good at it. Yeah. So all three, I mean, if you're interested, you can also follow these people on, you know, the things. But James is James PDF, and the others are just your names, right? Yeah, so easy to find, but James PDF, remember that one. And also, just finally, the Helmut Newton show that we've been talking about at the Jewish Museum is on until January, so there's really no excuse to go to that. Even if you hate it, just form an opinion. It's important. That's what art's for. There's also the screening of a movie there, and also the other film that a few of us referenced with the subject speaking is called The Bad and the Beautiful, which is kind of tricky to find online, but you can stream it. I think you can buy it from Amazon if you want. And I think that's it. I'd just like to say really heartfelt thanks for, you know, answering questions and just being so open and really generous and, you know, no bullshit, right? Like, so good, and thank you. It was lovely to share the stage with you tonight.
Thank you.
And thanks to the Wheeler Centre as well.